Okay, thank you everyone for coming. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'll let people in as they enter. There we go. So if you don't mind making sure that you're on mute just to lessen any background noise, we'd really appreciate that. My name is Morgan Neal. I'm the outreach coordinator for the Polk Soil and Water Conservation District. I've been in this position for a little over 6 months, and I'm just really excited to bring this presentation to you all today. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous history and the land that we'll speak about in this presentation. The Polk Soil and Water Conservation District is located within the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya, who are represented today by the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. Since time immemorial, they have been the historic caretakers of the land in this region. For that, we're grateful. Polk SWCD commits to caring for the land through promoting environmental stewardship and working to restore native habitat that provides a home to the birds that you'll hear about in today's presentation. To talk about these birds, we're pleased to welcome Harry Fuller. Harry will highlight some of the bird species that can be found at Cornerstone, Polk SWCD's 87-acre conservation easement in Polk County. Harry is the co-founder of the Partnership for International Birding. He's an avid bird blogger and is the author of Freeway Birding, San Francisco to Seattle, and co-author of Great Owls of California, Oregon, and Washington. Harry has also been instrumental in the upcoming installation of the Motus Wildlife Tracking Network at Ankeny Wildlife Refuge. We're grateful to have Harry here to share his enthusiasm of birds with you all. Sorry, I forgot to mention one more thing. If you do have questions, please type them into the chat box and we will save that for the end. Big welcome to you, Harry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oops, where was that? Why did I lose it? There we go. So Cornerstone Preserve is a special place.
Harry, sorry, you're on mute again, and could you share your screen with us?
Okay, share screen. Try it again. How's that? Can you see that?
Oh, yeah. Can you click to start the slideshow?
How's that?
Good. Yeah. So we see your
see a
slide that says native white oak.
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead.
All right. I'm going to back up one if I can. Not working. I don't know why it's not working. Huh.
Why don't you try stop share screen and start again?
Okay. All right. Okay, from current slide. Let's see if it goes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Cornerstone Preserve. Okay. This is a very special place. It's got some habitat that would have looked very similar even 300, 400, 500 years ago. It's very important. She mentioned the Native Americans. One of the ways they managed land here before the white man got here was they would burn it late every summer. So that would keep the brush down, so that what you had was a lot of oak savanna with mature oak trees and mostly forbs and grasses and annuals and perennials in between. And it was managed largely because the acorns and the deer and the rabbits were critical sources of food for the Native Americans. And they managed the land to maximize the health of the oak forests and the low-growing plants that helped to feed the deer and the rabbits, and also making acorns easier to gather. So the mature oak trees with a lot of smaller plants around them, once you got away from the streams and creeks, would have been the way the area looked. And there's some of Cornerstone Preserve that looks almost like it would have looked probably 200 years ago. There are some wonderful oak trees. There's also a creek, which is seasonal. Right now it's gurgling and quite loud. Probably by the end of the summer, it'll be down to a trickle or maybe just some pools. There are thickets. There are some old apple trees. There's a planting at the ridge top, which you can see here in the picture, of Douglas fir. There's quite a bit of open grassland. There's only one horse that's on the land, so there's not a herd of cattle. There's not a group of sheep. So most of the plants are allowed to do what they would do in a given season. There's also already some restoration work going on. And most importantly, for the birds and for birders, this piece of habitat of over 80 acres has lots of edges. And if you are an experienced birder, you know that the place where brush meets forest, where forest meets grassland, where grassland meets a marshy area, these are the areas that tend to attract the most birds and frankly produce the most food and also offer the best cover for smaller birds. There are a number of birds, sparrows particularly, but other birds that we have at Cornerstone Preserve that love to hide in the thickets but feed in the open. But they don't want to get 50 feet from the nearest bush. They only want to get a few feet. So edges are extremely important for the health of many of the bird species that we find in this part of Oregon. The native white oak is probably the most important single tree that you can find in this part of Oregon in terms of what it means for the rest of the habitat and for the animals and the other plants. Native white oak is the northernmost oak on the West Coast. It extends up into southern Washington. And then oaks beyond that are ones that have been planted. So the native oak forest went about as far north as the first 20, 30 miles of what is now Washington State, just on the other side of the Columbia River. And then the oak trees start to disappear. But where oaks are dominant, as they were here in the Willamette Valley in many areas, they're extremely important, partly because of the acorns, but also because they support so many other plants. Mistletoe is just the most obvious to us and to the western bluebird, which loves the mistletoe berries. And if there's still any left in the fall, waxwings, robins, thrushes will all dine on mistletoe berries when there's a good berry crop. The oaks also provide really important characteristics of wood. The wood is hard when it's alive. When it's dead or a branch is broken or diseased, it doesn't rot as quickly as, say, a cottonwood or a willow. It may last for decades. Even once a limb has fallen, it doesn't rot quickly. It stays around. It harbors mushrooms, it harbors beetles, it harbors worms, it harbors caterpillars, harbors salamanders. It's so important. The oak tree is an absolutely critical keystone species for so many plants and animals that live in and around them. So the fact that there are many mature oaks plus young oaks at Cornerstone makes it a very, very precious piece of land. One of the animals that lives around oak trees, and as soon as you get to the northern edge of the white oak range, this woodpecker disappears. This is the acorn woodpecker. He has many unique characteristics, one of which is the fact that he is the only colonial woodpecker we know of on the planet. The little village or colony of woodpeckers, of acorn woodpeckers that live in a particular oak forest, lay all their eggs in one nest. All the adults take part in both incubating the eggs and then feeding the nestlings. So it takes a village when it's acorn woodpeckers. All the adults help feed all the young, and all the adults work together to store acorns, which you see a small sample in what is probably a very old but still standing oak trunk on the right. They will drill individual holes, or they'll drill bigger cavities and fill them with acorns. And one of the reasons they do this, acorns not only attract insects, which they can eat when they eat the acorn, but acorns will last a long time. And they provide both starch and protein and some oils for these woodpeckers. So during a time of year when there may not be any insects around, or if there's a drought or a fire, the acorns allow the woodpeckers to last a long time. These woodpeckers are found in mostly more arid places than the Willamette Valley. This is just about the wettest climate where they live. But as you go south and inland, they're in very dry oak forests where some of the oak trees only have acorns every second year. Not all oaks have acorns annually like the white oak does. So they store enough acorns to last 3 years. So if there's a fire or a drought, the colony doesn't starve to death. They have enough acorns. And one of the reasons that they live in a colony is their two biggest enemies in taking acorns are bigger, tougher scrub jays and squirrels. But you have an entire militia, if you will, of acorn woodpeckers. And if a squirrel or a scrub jay happens to think he can go steal an acorn from them, he's outnumbered almost instantly and driven away. So they protect their acorn granary trees as really critical to the survival of their population. And as a result of the fact that they've got the granary trees and they're colonial, they don't migrate. They stay very close to where the village is centered. And any oak forest that has acorn woodpeckers will have them 365 days of the year. They may move around over a 20, 30, 40 acre plot, but they're never going to move. They're never going to migrate to Mexico. They're always going to be in or around where their acorns are stored. I'm not sure why it's not letting me move along. Why does it keep doing that? It was moving along and then all of a sudden it's not.
Let's try again.
Now I'm going to do it this way. The other really critical trees that are found there, much smaller, lining the creek, are willows. Willows, again, are very important keystone species. A lot of animals use willows either for protection or a place to nest. In the spring, a number of small birds can be seen eating the willow buds and the willow blossoms, and they form a very dense thicket, which is extremely safe for small birds that need to be able to hide from larger predators. The fluff is often used for nests. The seeds get eaten, the buds get eaten, and willows attract a lot of insects. And there's even evidence from some studies that the birds understand that willows are a source of natural aspirin. And a bird that's injured or not feeling well will go in and start to chew on the bark or the leaves of a willow tree. So willows are extremely important, and they are very thick along the creek at Cornerstone. And it's where many of the smaller birds will either be found hiding or feeding, and definitely nesting. Oops. The Douglas firs are up at the top of the hill. A Douglas fir is a tree that likes moisture. It likes fairly good soil, at least deep soil, and it provides deep shade, which means it produces a kind of habitat that is almost the opposite of what you find in oak forest. And you'll notice that often there are shade-loving ground covers. This picture on the right shows sword ferns, which are extremely common in many of the Douglas fir forests of Oregon. And particularly in the winter, this is an area we'll find birds that come down from denser forests to the north or the east. The Douglas fir forest at Cornerstone will likely have Pacific wrens, which won't nest there, but they'll come and stay in the fall and the winter. You're likely to get varied thrush in there. And then, of course, there are going to be birds that like conifers that wouldn't be caught, frankly, ever feeding in an oak tree. And willows are just don't fit the bill. And here are 3 birds that we're likely to find in the conifers. The Steller's jay, now they'll travel around a lot, and they will manage to defeat scrub jays just by being sneakier and faster, even though the scrub jays are bigger and bully the Steller's jays. But the Steller's jays love the dark of the forest. That's why they have the coloration they have. And they will basically dominate a forest as dense as the Douglas firs at Cornerstone. 2 other very much smaller birds that you find often in conifers. The red-breasted nuthatch is the guy down at the bottom left. He's the one you'll often hear in the forest blowing what sounds like he's blowing a little tin horn, going. He will occasionally come out of a conifer forest or go into a mixed forest, but he will nest and spend most of his time in conifers. And around here, that generally means Douglas fir. And the little guy on the right is a brown creeper. Now you'll find him on oak trunks and so forth, but he loves the soft barked conifers because the bark often gets lots of insects into it. It gets moss, it gets lichens, all of which attract insects, and spiders, and spider eggs, and caterpillars. And he and the nuthatch are bark gleaners, basically. They run up and down the trees, look for insects, bugs, sacks of spider eggs, anything they can find that's edible on the tree. And the brown creeper likes to start at the bottom and work up, as he's doing on the right. So he'll fly to the base of a tree and then work his way up the trunk and maybe out some of the limbs. But these 3 birds are quite likely to be found mostly in and around conifers. One of the birds that's going to be in the thickets and will come out into the open, particularly after the young are old enough to fly, is the California quail. They particularly like heavy thickets this time of year when they're laying eggs and then having young, because the young can run from the moment they're born. They're precocial that way, but they have tiny little wings and it'll be weeks before they can fly. And because they can't fly and they're on the ground and they're not faster than a coyote, cover is the only way they can survive. They need to be someplace either in or near a thicket where bigger predators are not going to go after the babies. One bird that's definitely going to be there, and it's going to be there year-round now with climate change, is the Anna's hummingbird. There's a female on her nest, sitting on her eggs on the upper left, and the male on the right. Their main field mark that separates from any other hummingbirds that might pass through or nest in the area is the fact that the male has this beautiful shiny gorget, and it comes up above his beak, comes up onto the top of his head. He's the only bird in the Western United States that has color above the beak. All the others that have bright throats, it stops at the eye and the beak. Anna's, for a hummingbird, is medium sized. He's certainly not even close to the smallest one. tends to have a gray chest, and the back on both the male and the female tends to be a bright, shiny green that can be iridescent and look other colors in bright sunlight. But if you get a good look at it from not too far away, it should look mostly green. The female doesn't have the fancy throat that the male has. This guy is sadly all about himself. He has nothing to do with the nest, the eggs, feeding the young, or feeding the babies. That's unusual. The only other set of birds that tend to be like that are ducks, where the male ducks don't have anything to do with the female or the eggs or the babies. But most birds, whether it's Canada geese, California quail, American robins, you'll find the male is deeply, deeply involved in raising the young, and in many cases provides all the food for the entire family until the babies can feed themselves. Probably the most common hawk we'll see at Cornerstone is the red tail. He tends to soar, as most of you know, if you're any kind of birding at all, you see them soaring often 200 or 300 or 400 yards up in the air. This happens to be a youngster because he's still got the banded tail, and there are still some youngsters around from last year. But the breeding adults will have the red tail already, and they are definitely not befriended by smaller birds. This happens to be a blackbird attacking one of the branch here, and blackbirds this time of year are extremely aggressive toward bigger birds, particularly towards predatory birds. But the red tails will hunt from soaring up high, and they're looking mostly for animals they can catch in the open. They catch their prey on the ground. They're not fast like a peregrine. They don't take anything out of the air. They're looking for predator prey that they can find on the ground. And as a predator, they're pretty omnivorous. So they'll take snakes, they'll take any mammal that they can kill. They'll take birds if they can come up from behind on a mourning dove or a quail or something like that that's worth the effort. They won't go after little birds, but they will go after bigger birds that feed on the ground. And they're known occasionally even to take an occasional chicken, as will great horned owls. But the red-tailed hawk will probably nest on the ridgetop in one of the oaks, or maybe in a Douglas fir up near the top so that they don't have to fight their way through the foliage. But they like to be able to soar to the nest, carrying prey, and then land easily. So they don't really hide their nests. They're aggressive enough about protecting them that they don't mind nesting out in the open. And we did see a nest that we thought might be a red-tailed nest in one of the oaks, and we'll check that out in May. They'll probably already have their young out of the nest by the time we do our field trip. This is a guy that we did see. We did a scouting trip a few days ago. There was a Cooper's hawk way up at the top of the ridge, sitting in an oak tree. It's an adult on the left, a youngster on the right, and one of their field marks, besides the fact that they have sort of stubby wings, and they tend to, when they're moving around in the air, it's flat glide. They can't coast and soar the way a red tail does. Their wings are very short, and the reason is they're built for chasing smaller birds through the foliage and into forests. So they can maneuver their way between branches, even in a pretty dense forest, and that's where they'll hunt. And they'll go after anything from mourning dove and band-tailed pigeon on down to siskins and juncos. One of the field marks that you may notice when they're in the air, see all those white feathers at the base of the body? It's actually white feathers that they use to cover up their legs, in the winter. But they will often show when they're flying, sort of sticking out, puffing out by the side of the tail, which is much longer in proportion to the body than, say, a red tail, who has a fairly stubby tail. And this is the youngster on the right. But he has the same shape. Another key field mark for the Cooper's hawk is it has fairly muscular legs. If this was his little cousin, the sharp shin, the legs would look like tiny little twigs. But this is a pretty muscular bird, and he can handle fairly large prey for his size. Probably one of the most important species out there is going to be the flicker. The guy on the left, I took this picture in my yard. He's everywhere in the Willamette Valley. He's a very flexible, very adaptable woodpecker. The only species of woodpecker we have that regularly feeds on the ground, where he'll go after ants. I've even seen him take earthworms. He'll be in a flock of robins and starlings, and there he is plucking the earthworms just like a robin. But they do some very important things, and we'll talk about this again later. But one of the most important things they do is they drill holes in dead trees, in soft trees, in dead limbs on oaks, and they end up using a tiny proportion of the holes they drill. So if you're a chipmunk or a flying squirrel or a couple of nuthatches looking for a nest hole, this guy is the real estate agent par excellence. He provides housing and hideouts for all kinds of creatures, not to mention, you know, the fungus and the mold and the lichens and all the other stuff that can get in under the bark once this guy drills a hole. The guy on the right is our smallest woodpecker, but also quite common, particularly where there are thickets like there are along the creek here, and that's the Downy Woodpecker. He tends to not range very far, so if we see downies, we can almost bet that that pair is nesting somewhere within a few acres of where we see them. And their young won't go very far. They don't migrate. They're here year round. And they love any habitat around here where there's running water and where there's willow thickets. So Cornerstone is just ideal for the Downy Woodpecker. Western wood pewee, haven't seen them there yet, but they'll be around. They'll be coming back anytime soon. This is a member of the flycatcher family. And almost all of these birds in this family migrate out, and they haven't come back yet. They are heavy users of insects, so they don't want to get back here too soon. So they tend to come at the end of April, sometimes not even till mid or late May, but they will nest in open forests like that. And you'll see him often when he's sitting. He'll be sitting up high, doesn't hide. He's not a skulker. He's not secretive. He sits up at the top and says, I'm a flycatcher. I'm in charge here. They call us tyrant flycatchers because we're tough. Even though he's about the size of a big sparrow, he's afraid of essentially nobody, and he'll sit right out in the open. You'll see that little top knot and the little tail line down the center of his chest, and he'll often be making a little buzzy sound or a whispery sound. And he'll fly out, often catching something in the air and fly right back to where he came from. Classic flycatcher behavior. And he should be back, and they should be very evident when we're there in May. These guys, I could talk for hours about the corvid family. It's the crows, the jays, the ravens, the magpies. If you travel overseas, you know, it's the rook, it's the chough, it's the jackdaw. These guys are mostly social. They communicate a lot to each other. They are very smart. They were one of the first animals that put the lie to the fact that humans were the only tool maker. When they found crows on islands in the Pacific making tools to pry worms out of logs and out from underneath the rock. They're extremely good at problem solving. There's been a lot of study done of animal intelligence in the last 30, 40 years. And it turns out ravens are smarter than almost all the mammals. Probably even some of our neighbors would have a tough time competing with ravens. They're very good at solving problems. They figure it out. They look at it, they test it, and then they go, oh, I know how to do that. And they do it. They've got now ravens and crows that can solve puzzles that have been made that take 6 or 7 steps. And once they figure out how to do it, they teach the other ones how to do it. One of the classic examples was a very simple test that was done 25, 30 years ago, where they had some captive ravens, and they let one into a big cage with a cable stretched across it, and they hung a block of cheese about 3 feet down on a string below the cable. And of course, he couldn't reach it, and they don't flutter. You know, it'd been a warbler or something, he'd just flutter around and take little pieces. But he needed to get to the cheese, and he could tell what it was, probably could smell it, but he could certainly see it. And he flew around and looked at it a couple of times, and finally reached down with his beak, grabbed the string, pulled it up, held it with his leg, pulled the string some more, and finally he got it all the way up so he could get the cheese. And he ate the cheese, and then they took this raven and put him back in the pen with the other ravens, and they waited a month. Then they took raven number 2, who'd never been in the cage, never seen what happened. put him into the cage with the hanging cheese, and he instantly knew what to do because Raven number one had explained it to him. Said, by the way, if you ever see cheese hanging down, this is what you do. We don't know how they communicate these ideas, but they do. They communicate. They have a culture. They pass on ideas, warnings, problem solving from one generation to the next. And since then, there have been even more complicated tests of crows and ravens and jays, and they pass on all kinds of information. My favorite story about these birds, and if you're a fanatic like I am and you read all the bird stories, you probably read about the magpies in Australia. One of the things that makes this Motus station work is you attach tiny little transmitters to the back of a bird that have almost no weight, and it transmits 24/7, and these towers pick up the signal and say, okay, that's Swainson's hawk from Alaska or from Kansas just passed over Texas and he's heading south. So the towers pick up these signals from these tiny little transmitters. So they were going to do a study of a population of magpies in eastern Australia that move around a lot to figure out how they use the habitat and where they nest and stuff. And they attached 6 of these little things with tiny little harnesses. The magpies got together and ripped them off of each other. They didn't keep them on for even 2 days. Within less than 48 hours, the magpies had destroyed all the transmitters. And in some cases, they tore them apart once they got them off. So don't try to outsmart the raven. He knows what he's doing. Tree swallows, we saw them. The picture on the upper right, in fact, was taken at Cornerstone just a few days ago. Tree swallows are cavity nesters. The 2 at the top are a pair. The female's not quite as iridescent and shiny as the male, but they have that bright white chest and a little white chin. And they will nest in the boxes. And if they can find an old thicker or downy nest hole in a tree that looks safe, they'll use that too. But they're very quick to use nest boxes. And they were already in and out of a couple of them that are at Cornerstone when we were there last week. Down at the bottom is a barn swallow. They're going to nest in that area too. They will, as the name implies, use human structures. And in that case, probably under the eave of a barn or a shed or a garage. They will nest inside a building if there's a big enough opening and they're sure of being able to get in and out. So they love, for example, the kinds of sheds where people put hay or tractors and don't have solid walls. The third species of swallow that I don't have a picture of here is cliff swallow. We saw a colony of them flying around. So they're the ones that build mud nests in a whole row. Looks like a ready-made set of condos, sort of igloo shaped with tiny little holes in each round globe of mud. So they're probably going to nest on this outside of one of the big buildings out there in that area. So it'll be interesting to see if they're still around in May, because they were just arriving in the last couple of weeks. So they may be going to settle near enough that we will see them hunting at Cornerstone. But I can almost guarantee you we'll see tree swallows and barn swallows because there's so many opportunities for them to nest there. And with the creek and the open land and the healthy forest, there's going to be plenty of insects for these guys to eat. These are 2 of the coolest birds in North America, I gotta say. They're on the upper right and lower right are bush tits. If you have feeders, or even if you just spend time out in your garden, if you've got one and you've got bushes around, the bush tit is our smallest non-hummingbird. And except this time of year, you see them in gangs. I once had a birder when I was first starting instruct me that the average flock size of bush tits in the fall is 22.3. You don't always see the 0.3, but you see the 22. They come and go in big gangs. They're very nervous. They're very tiny. They never sit still unless they're babies just out of the nest. But a flock of adult and grown bush tits are constantly on the move. They will always amaze you. They'll come to your soot feeder if you have one, and they'll spend exactly 34.5 seconds, and then they'll move on. They may come back in 2 or 3 minutes, but they don't sit there like a woodpecker or a nuthatch and feed until they're full. They're too nervous. They're always on the move. And the guy on the upper left is a wren tit, and he's much more secretive. You never see him in flocks. He loves the thickets along the creek out there because You can barely even see him when he's moving around inside. And he'll be about 8 or 9 layers of branches back in the thicket of berries or willows or whatever brush is really thick out there. And he will only come out, the male will come out if you irritate him enough. And he has a song like a bouncing ball. If you're ever in areas with that kind of thicket, you may hear it. He goes, beep, 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 beep. You may never see him, however, even if he's singing. He's got a fairly long tail, and he's got this sort of dull, dark brown body. He has no fancy markings on him at all. He's just sort of a dark version, if you will, of the bush tit. And one of the other things that these two species have in common, besides their small size, although the wren tit is much bigger than the bush tit, is they are each the only member of their family to have survived after crossing the Alaskan land bridge. All the wren tit cousins are in the parrotbill family, and they're spread all over Asia and North Africa. But there's only one parrotbill anywhere in North America, and it's here on the West Coast, the wren tit, which is found from Astoria south to Baja. One of the wonderful ironies of the story is his ancestors at some point came across from Siberia to Alaska. But once the Columbia River was formed by a giant ice flood, the wren tit was stuck south of the Columbia River. There has never been a wren tit seen in Washington state. It's 1.5 miles of water from Astoria to Washington, and this guy is never going to fly that far across open water. So he is very sedentary, and he hides out in the brush in coastal and inland valley California, never goes east of the Cascades, never goes east of the Sierra, never goes south of Baja, and he stays home. If you're bird banding in an area where there's wren tits, you're going to catch the same pair of wren tits week in, week out, as long as they're alive. It'll be there. There was one when they were bird banding years ago at Point Reyes. They caught him 48 times in 1 week because they put their mist net up where he was used to flying, and he wasn't going to change his habits. He just flew into the nest every day, and they'd release him, and he'd fly back in the evening into the same mist net. So they're very, very sedentary birds. The bush tits are much more interested in moving around. As I said, they move a lot. When they build a nest, they're very interesting. They build a big, long, hanging sock of grass. They can build, this is a bird that's less than 5 inches long. He'll build a nest that's a foot long with hundreds of grass in it and lichens, and holds it together with cobwebs. And they'll lay a number of eggs at the bottom of that sock. And then when it's time for the babies to get out, they'll chew a hole in it, and the babies will all escape. And they're from a family of long-tailed birds called long-tailed tits, which are common in Europe and Africa and Asia. And again, they're the only one anywhere in America. These are a couple of birds that you're going to find in the thickets, sometimes down on the ground, sometimes up in the shrubbery a few feet. The one on the right is the white-breasted nuthatch. He will actually go quite a ways up an oak tree. He tends to like oaks and cottonwoods. You're not going to see him in the Douglas fir. He's a close cousin to the red-breasted nuthatch that we saw when we did the conifers. And again, this guy will work his way down the tree trunk and use that long beak of his to pry bugs out. The guy in the upper left is a Pacific wren. I mentioned him. You'll notice he's in the ferns. This is exactly where you look for the Pacific wren in the winter. In the summer, they go back up in the mountains and nest in the dense forest. But when they come down to the valley in the fall, in the winter, look for them under dense canopy where there are sword ferns. And sometimes there'll be half a dozen of them in a hillside of sword ferns, chasing each other around, fussing and fighting and wagging that tiny little tail of theirs. Black-capped chickadee. If you have feeders, you've probably got black-capped chickadees in your garden and around your house. This time of year, there's only a couple of them, but often you'll see a little gang. Maybe it's a family group, maybe it's as many as 6 or 7. And because they're native and because they don't migrate, in the winter, they often attract the migrant birds. So if there's a yellow rump warbler around, if there's birds that have come down out of the mountains, like pine siskins, other birds that don't nest down here, that don't really know the territory. If you want to know which is the best restaurant in town, you ask the locals. If you're a migrant bird and you come here for the winter, you listen for the chickadees. They're always making noise. They're always moving around. They're not terribly afraid of other birds. So if you're a stranger here and you arrive in October and you want to know where to eat, you follow the chickadees because they've got it knocked. They're moving all the time. They're very smart. They're very quick. If you put out food, they're usually the first bird to arrive. They'll check it out. They'll be a little bit cautious, but they're bold. They're not afraid to try something new, and they'll be probably the first birds on your feeder. And the black-capped chickadees are pretty common in areas where there's oaks, where there's willows, where there's brush. If there are other chickadees there, they'll be up in the Douglas fir, and they're likely to be the slightly smaller chestnut-backed chickadee. But definitely the black-capped chickadee, almost the first bird we saw when we got out of our cars at Cornerstone, were chickadees moving through the trees along the creek. And they'll be there year-round. This is another bird that's year-round. This is Buick's wren. He's going to be down with the black-capped chickadees and the song sparrows along the creek and in the oaks. A very strong singer. All the wrens have good voices. This guy has a really good song. He's one of the few birds we have here that will sing a whole song in January. The sun comes out, 38 degrees. This guy's sitting on top of a bush singing, going, boy, I love the sunshine. And he's a very aggressive little bird. He's got that white eye stripe and a pale chest, fairly long tail. He's about the size of a smaller sparrow, but quite active, very quick to react if he sees somebody or something he likes or doesn't like. Very aggressive little bird, and you'll never see them in flocks. You'll see one or two or a family group, but they are not tolerant of many other birds that are competing with them for seeds or for insects. So they've been known to go after birds as big as blackbirds and robins and just chase them out of a thicket because they don't like what they're doing. And Buick's wrens are around year-round. So again, you're likely to see them anytime you go to a place like Cornerstone. This is the thrush family. In the upper right, of course, is probably one of the best known birds in North America. It's the American robin. He feeds on the ground. Both adults work very hard at raising young. They will often nest twice, sometimes 3 times if there's a good food supply. They tend to migrate. So the ones we have in January aren't the same individuals that we have in July. The ones we get come down from Alaska and they stay for a while and then they go back, and our guys are down playing golf in San Diego and then they come back and nest. But we almost always have robins here. There's usually a little gap in the fall, maybe late September, when your robins have left and their robins haven't arrived yet. And you look around, you go, there aren't any robins in the park. There's no robins on my lawn, but they'll be back. Robins are very omnivorous. They're good at getting food on the ground. They like fruit. If you've got a crabapple or a hawthorn or Oregon grape, any of the plants that have sort of waxy fruit that doesn't rot right away, like blackberries, they'll be at them all fall long, all winter long until the fruit's gone. Upper left are western bluebirds. We saw a pair at Cornerstone. And if they're lucky, they'll get one of the nest boxes before the tree swallows take them all. If not, they'll nest in an old flicker nest hole. Again, they're cavity nesters. They're not as big as a robin and they don't have that beautiful song, but they do have the blue feathers, which makes up for the lack of music. And they will often catch prey on the ground. They will fly out over an open area, a grassy area, and see a grasshopper or something on the ground and go down and grab it. They tend to not get at the tops of trees like robins do, but tend to stay close to the earth because that's where they get most of their food. And the guy in the lower left We heard him calling. We never actually saw him. It's the Swainson's thrush, and they're just now coming back from the tropics. They're one of the migrants that comes back in April. And they have a beautiful musical circular song that we'll listen to even on my player, even if we don't hear the bird themselves, but we will definitely listen to it while we're out there. And they will nest along the creeks. They like thickets along running water. You're not going to find them in the middle of the field. You're not going to find them in the Douglas fir. You're going to find them along the creek and very close to the creek. And the deeper the thicket, the better they like it. These are two birds that should be coming back any day now. I've had friends in Southern Oregon tell me they're already seeing the guy on the left. That's the black-headed grosbeak. He's a migrant. He's got a big, loud voice. And if you know the American Robin song, take it, multiply it by 10, turn up the volume, and don't stop to take a breath. That's a black-headed grosbeak. He sounds like a robin that never quits. He just keeps going. He sings and sings and sings. And I know from experience, he'll start at 4 o'clock in the morning. If it's May and the testosterone is flowing, he'll just start singing, and he may go on for 10 minutes. You say, how can he do that? He doesn't even seem to stop for a breath. And he's related to the eastern cardinal, if you've ever lived in the East. And it's a family of birds with big, heavy beaks. They can crush seeds and nuts. They can eat fruit. They can grab hard bodied beetles. They are really omnivorous, even though it looks like what their beak is built for is just crushing seeds. They will take almost anything. They'll come to a feeder and just clean it out. Particularly when they first arrive in the spring, there'll be a bunch of them before they split up the territories and mate. There may be 5 or 10 or 15 of them come to your feeder, and they'll just clean it out in no time at all. Not a very big bird, not as big as a robin, but pretty ferocious and very loud when they're around. And the male is beautiful. The female is a little more duller colored and doesn't have the shiny silver beak. But they, again, are birds that like thickets and forests of deciduous trees. So again, Cornerstone has exactly the right kind of habitat. The waxwings should be coming back. He's the guy on the right with the little raccoon mask. He tends to be a fruit and seed eater. Will show up in big flocks and tend to nest in loose colonies. They won't nest right next to each other, but more like herons, where if there's a set of trees that they like and there's a good food supply, there may be in 20 trees, 30 or 40 nests, 2 or 3 in a tree, never right next to each other like the cliff swallows that just jam their nests one next to each other. These guys will space it out, but they like to be in a group where there's other waxwings around, and you almost never see a waxwing. You see the waxwings, and there may be anywhere from a family group to 40 or 50 of them. And when they fly, they tend to fly in the air in a tight-knit group, a lot like shorebirds do at the beach. And so you'll see this group of sort of salmon-colored birds going overhead. There'll be a tight little knot of 15 or 20 of them, gotta be waxwings. And of course, this time of year with their fancy new plumage, they've all got the little gold bar at the base of the tail. There are going to be finches there. There are going to be at least 2, maybe as many as 5 species. The guy on the left is a male house finch. I took his picture just a few days ago. And this time of year, the male house finches have all kinds of bright color around their face, and it depends on their diet. If they've been eating enough carotene, they can get bright orange. Some of them look almost yellow. Others may be bright red. It really depends on the diet, because as they molt in the spring, the coloring on their feathers depends on how much carotene and what variety of carotene is in their diet when they're growing those feathers. And they're around, and they do really well around people. They don't mind most of what we've done to the habitat, as long as there's plenty of plants with plenty of seeds. And they will frequent your feeder. If you live in town and you put out seeds, you're likely to get house finches pretty quickly. They do, however, carry and become victims of various eye diseases. So if you see one with a swollen eye, you need to take your feeders down and clean them out right away. The guy on the right is a male lesser goldfinch. Unlike the American goldfinch, he has a green back. The American goldfinch, of course, is the golden colored bird you see on all the Christmas cards that are printed back east because they don't have lesser goldfinch. But we have both lesser and American. The lesser is here year round, and the male never completely loses that black crown. So even in January, he's going to have a green back and a little bit of black around his forehead. Many of the American goldfinches we have here, which are bigger than the lesser and paler and with the yellow back on the males, many of them migrate out. So they're not as common in December as they are now in April and May. And the lesser goldfinch likes more open countryside. He's likely to nest in a shrub in the middle of an open field. They love thistles and tall growing weeds and grasses that have seed stalks up on the top in the summer and the fall. And so they're much more likely to be in open countryside. Even if they're nesting in the willows along the creek, they're going to be feeding out in the fields. This is a young purple finch, and you see he's got a face pattern. House finches never have that. This guy is more likely to be found up near the Douglas fir. They've got a bigger beak than a house finch. They're better equipped to deal with pine cones and hard seeds from conifers. And the male will be less streaky than a house finch. This is a youngster with that pattern on his face. This is a bird you're probably familiar with. If you have any kind of garden or yard at all in the Willamette Valley, you've got spotted Towies. He's the biggest member of the sparrow family here in the Willamette Valley. He'll hiss at you. You hear him go bzzz sometimes out of a bush if you walk too close. The male has a shiny black head and chest and bright orange sides. The female has much the same pattern. Her black is not quite as dark. She's more charcoal, and her orange a little more subdued. But these guys also, like the wren tits, tend to be pretty fixed to their territory. A couple, as long as they're healthy, will stay together for maybe several seasons, raise their young. The male has that bright red eye, and they eat almost any kind of plant matter that's edible. Plus, obviously, when they're raising young and the female is producing eggs, they're going to eat insects to get the extra protein. They tend to stay down pretty low. So again, the thickets along the creek, ideal place for spotted Towies. And we saw several when we were out there a week ago. And they're going to be there year round. They're not going to move. They're not going to migrate. They don't even wander very much like this tip. They just stay put, more like the wren tit. This is song sparrow. He's singing now, and he's not as big as a towie and clearly not as colorful. A little more bolder in singing. He'll get up higher and more out in the open. A beautiful song, and we'll play it when we're out there, and you'll probably hear them. They'll still be singing. They tend to sing until the babies are out of the nest. So he's going to be advertising the fact that he's got a mate, or he's got eggs, or they've got young in the nest. And again, he likes running water. So he's going to be in the willows and the thicket along the creek. And he's going to basically feed there, though he will tend to get down on the ground and often feeds on the ground, even in the thicket or out by the edge of the trail. But you're not going to see him in the middle of the grassy fields. This is a guy that's just come back. This is the orange crown warbler. I've been seeing him around my house for about a week and a half now. He tends to like the tops of trees like oaks, cottonwoods, taller willows. You're not going to see him in the conifers, but you're going to see him in the bigger trees, the bigger oaks, the bigger willows, the bigger alders. Tends to move around a lot like warblers do. Handsome little bird with a dark line through his eye, and a sort of greenish back and a little bit of dark on the wings. And he is, like most warblers, he tends to be looking mostly for insect eggs. But if there's a bit of fruit or some sunflower seeds on your feeder, he's more than happy to take it. And he will nest probably a couple of times this year before he migrates out. This is a young common yellowthroat, and they're going to be pretty abundant there along the creek. They're much more skulking and much more secretive than the orange crown. The male actually has a really dark black raccoon mask on his face, and they will be down in the thickets. We heard them calling, a number of them. They have a sort of a witchity, 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 witchity call that they use. They're quite territorial, and they'll spread out along the creek, and there'll probably be a mated pair raising young about every 40 or 50 feet along that creek, because the habitat is so ideal for them. And again, they need running water. The orange crown is much more likely to nest up in the big tall oaks. He doesn't care about water. What he likes is a lot of dense foliage that's not a conifer, that's not oily and greasy and pungent smelling. So he may nest, 40 feet up in an oak tree, 200 yards from the nearest water. He doesn't care. These guys are going to be near the water all the time. So this is a look up the hillside. It gives you an idea of some of the edges, which are such good birding spots at Cornerstone. You've got a grassy field that goes up and meets oaks and probably ash and maybe alder. It's too dry and too high for cottonwoods, and there's going to be shrubs underneath. And then behind that, you've got the row of Douglas fir. So you've got two edges. You've got where the conifers meet the deciduous, and then you've got where the deciduous meets the grassland. So this, if you're a bird that likes variety and you're looking for different kinds of food, this is an ideal place. And there's plenty of cover. If you're a wren, you can hide in here. If you're an orange crowned warbler, you can go in here and hide, or a robin can go in there, and they might even nest in there. This is just a piece of habitat that just says, come on, birds, you're going to love it. This is the grove of mature oaks. Some of these obviously predate agriculture. They've probably been there a couple hundred years, some of them even more. A little bit of human residue, but not too bad. And as you can see, nature is making use of it. Last but not least, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the avian viral pandemic, the avian flu that's moving around. It's been found so far as close as Idaho. There has been no confirmed cases yet in Oregon, but I think it's unrealistic to assume that it won't make it here. There are other dangerous, contagious diseases. So you need to try to keep, if you've got feeders, you need to try to keep them clean using bleach or some other disinfectant. The house finch disease has been around for a long time. It was discovered first in the 1980s, and it tends to break out in a local area and then die down and come back again. And salmonella, of course, will spread from spoiled flu. But we're watching the avian viral pandemic and its move from the East Coast to the West as far as Idaho. It hasn't been found in Oregon or California as far as I know yet. And Morgan will send you this link if you're curious, and particularly if you've got feeders, or if you've got chickens or ducks or any poultry of your own. It's a disease that will kill anything from eagles down to hummingbirds once it gets started. So if anybody's got questions, I'll be happy to see if I can answer.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions or comments?
We are, by the way, Morgan and I have talked about possibly putting together a second birding trip that would probably be sometime in June. So keep in touch if you're interested in that. If you're not coming in May, or even if you are coming in May, you want to do it again. Because there's a lot of change. By June, there will be a lot of young birds out of the nest.
Yeah, someone asked, is Cornerstone a place we can visit? The answer is yes, but you do need to have contact Polk SWCD, email myself. We need to arrange a time. It's by permit only, so it is gated, and we just need to keep track of people that are out there. We do have, as Harry said, bird walk scheduled for May 19th in the morning, and he's interested in doing future bird walks as well. I had one more question, Harry, for you. Which tits create the hanging sock nest?
The bush tit. It's the
Bush tit?
Yeah. We only have about 4 species that build closed nests. The Bullock's oriole makes a purse that usually hangs from 2 or 3 points on a tree. The bush tit builds a teardrop shaped nest that hangs from the center. So it looks like a giant sock hanging from right in the middle, and it's made mostly out of grass. The marsh wren, who will nest in cattail marshes, tends to build a sort of globe, and it usually uses old dead cattail limbs, leaves, or whatever it can find in the marsh. It doesn't fly around out in dry land like a lot of birds do looking for stuff. I mean, I've seen crows and robins and flickers and birds like that carrying nesting material. Sometimes they'll carry it a quarter of a mile. If you're a crow and you find the right stick, you just pick it up and carry it back to the nest. But marsh wrens tend to stay in the cattails, and so they use what they can find in the marsh to build their little enclosed domes with a tiny little hole in it. So those are the 3 birds we have here that build enclosed nests. In some parts of the world, like in the dry parts of Africa, weaver birds that will build huge colonies of 50 or 60 nests, all little globes, all in one tree. But we don't have those. The oriole has a cousin in the tropics called the Oripendula that will get into one tree, and they build huge 3-foot long nests that hang from the center. And it looks like these giant Christmas ornaments hanging off this tree. And there'll be 40 or 50 of them in one big tree. But we don't have any birds in the West that do that. So we only have a few, and the bush tit is the smallest bird we have that builds a closed nest.
Thank you. Yeah, we got a couple more questions. Judy asked about carpooling. If you've already registered for the May field trip, please email me, Judy, and we can talk about carpooling over there. Rick asked, where's Cornerstone located? Good question. North Central Polk County, off of Sunnyside Road, which is off of Van Well Road. 87 acres. Harry, it's hard to hear you, Harry.
It's about 4 miles due west of Basket Slough.
Yeah, and then someone else asked, will we get a copy of the slideshow so we can do a little research before the bird walk? Harry, would it be possible to have you email me your slideshow, or?
I don't know whether I can email it, but I can send it to you on a disk or something. I think it's too big to email. But I can get you a copy, and if you've got a way to post it somewhere where people can download it or whatever, that'd be great.
Okay. Also, Edith, I am recording this meeting, so you can always go back and rewatch it that way, but we will work on figuring out a way to get you a printable version of this. And Sue asked, which swallow creates the mud nests outside of buildings? The third swallow you mentioned.
Right. They're called cliff swallows, but they're very smart, and there aren't many cliffs, but there are lots of bridges and lots of school buildings and lots of barns, and that's where they've moved to. They've become quite common in parks and other places where people don't take the hose and knock down their nests. There's a real movement among swallow lovers to try to keep even schools from doing that. I mean, they used to say, oh, well, you can't have the swallow poop on the sidewalk, might infect a 6-year-old. Well, in fact, it's pretty harmless. But so there's an education program to try to keep people from knocking down swallow nests, but they will build colonies under bridges, sometimes sports stadiums, any place where there's an overhang, and usually a flat wall, cement, or wood without lots of perforations in it. And they stick their nest to that, and they build a whole condo. Sometimes there'll be 150 nests in one place if there's enough space. And they use mud, one mouthful at a time. And every year they build a whole new colony, even though it might be exactly the same place they were the year before. They won't use last year's nest. I have seen house sparrows using old cliff swallow nests. But the cliff swallows themselves will never re-nest in the same hole. They only nest once a year. They're migratory. They go south and come back. And they're quite successful almost anywhere where there's enough insects if they find a good, safe place to nest. And they're the ones that the whole thing in Capistrano is about, because they nested on the mission out there. And they've been doing that now for a couple hundred years.
Thank you so much, Sue. It's good to see you on this call. We've reached our time, so if you do have
Okay.
any further questions, I'm sure we can share Harry's email address.
Yes.
I plan to send out an email to everyone with Harry's blog, his website. I've recorded this, so I'll send you a link to the recording if you want to share with any of your bird enthusiast friends. Harry, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And thank you to everyone for being here and your interest in learning about the birds and their native habitat in Polk County. I am very excited to have more events like this and tours. So please be sure to check out our website, our Facebook page, subscribe to our newsletter. You'll be sure to get the notifications of future events that we have going on. So thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you, Harry.
Thank you.